Thank you very much, Heiner. Welcome everyone to my presentation. It's my pleasure today to present research we are conducting at the Geoinformation Group of the University of Bonn. This group works on topics which fit nicely under the term computational cartography, and I'm also going to explain this term in my presentation. So let's begin with the easy part. It's almost unnecessary to explain what a map is and what cartography is. So maps are everywhere. They appear in public science books, for example, in fiction, of course. Everyone likes maps, it seems. We love maps so much that we consider it fun even to fight against the pandemic if we have a map as a board game, for example. And of course, maps are also used for computer games pretty often. Maps are also not just nice, they are also needed urgently for important problems, in particular to detect spatial patterns or spatial temporal patterns. Here, for example, that's some piece of our own work. I'm also going to explain in more detail in my presentation about visualizing droughts in Germany, but also you will find such maps like the one here quite often in the newspapers and online media nowadays, of course. This one is from the German newspaper Zeit, visualizing the spread of the coronavirus in Germany. Well, cartography is also a scientific discipline. It's defined by the International Cartographic Association, the ICA, and it's the discipline dealing with everything you can do with maps, basically, with the conception, production, dissemination, and study of maps. The ICA also has a definition of a map. This is a quite lengthy definition. I'm not going to spell out this in detail, but I would like to highlight two terms here. Namely, a map is a symbolized image, and it presents selected features or selected characteristics. So the aim of a map is never to explain or to present everything. It's in all its aspects and in all its details. A photorealistic image, for example, is not a map. Yeah, so a map is always abstracting from reality. That is an important feature of a map. So now let's get to the more complicated part. The term computational cartography is actually not that well defined. There's no standard definition anywhere. I'm using it here, first of all, to refer to the combination between computer science and cartography, of course. But in particular, I'm using it here also to refer to the combination of theoretical and practical aspects of computing in cartography. And just to give you one example for each of these topics, well, if we think of practical aspects of computing and cartography, what you can see here is basically the workflow used by the national mapping authorities in Germany to produce topographic maps. It starts, of course, with data acquisition, for example, with terrestrial sensors or aerial images. So with that, we get a detailed digital landscape model, ATGIS Basis DLM, called in Germany. And then we have a process called generalization, so that we obtain from this detailed data set less detailed models, DLM 50, 250, and 1000. And from these models, we derive digital maps. So these models here, they are independent of, well, symbolization, for example. So when you derive maps, you still have to place text and you have to decide for the symbols. Whereas in these digital landscape models, you have basically geometry plus attributes of objects. Well, and every arrow that you see in this workflow corresponds to several computational problems that have to be solved. Then let's look at the other end, the theoretical aspects. This is probably the most well-known result in theoretical computer science related to cartography. You will find this result in every graph theory textbook. It states that every map is four-colorable, which means just that if you have a polygon map, so a map of countries, for example, what you can do is you can assign a color to every country such that no two adjacent countries receive the same color. And then you can do this always with at most 4 colors. So 4 colors are always sufficient. And sometimes you find this theorem also stated like this. So not every map is 4-colorable, but in, well, graph theory textbooks, you also find sometimes this version where it's said every planar graph is 4-colorable. And the relationship here is simply that, well, this graph we're talking about is the adjacency graph of these polygons. So it seems that there's a rather big gap between these practical problems and these theoretical results, but in fact, what I'm showing on the next slides is that graph theory is, well, an important basis, of course, also for very practical problems. And one type of graphs that are important in cartography are already mentioned, namely these adjacency graphs, which you can see here. So on the following slides, I'm going to introduce a few more types of graphs that are important for us. One thing which is particularly important for us for aggregation and clustering tasks are proximity graphs. Well, in my group, we work quite a lot on aggregation problems. I'm not talking about this today in detail, just to give you an impression how this could work in the most easiest way. Well, maybe we have a point data set like this, points of different categories, and we would like to aggregate them into polygons or larger clusters, for example. So what you can do there is use some proximity graph, maybe a Delaunay triangulation is quite often used. And then you can basically throw away all these edges connecting 2 points of different colors of different categories. And what you have then are connected components defining clusters. So that would be a most straightforward way of clustering these categorical point data. Another type of graphs in cartography are shortcut graphs. They are very often used for line simplification, line schematization tasks. One very frequently cited method is the one by Imaiiri. And basically what you are given there is somehow a cartographic line, maybe the border between 2 countries, and also somehow an error tolerance. So you say with this error tolerance as a user, you can specify the level of detail you would like to have in the output. So the larger the tolerance, the less details you have in the output. And what this algorithm does then, actually, it solves an optimization problem. Namely, it tries to select as few vertices as possible, such that these selected vertices define a simplified line that satisfies the so-called epsilon bandwidth criterion. And this is basically quite straightforward. So if you have maybe such an edge in the output, that would be allowed according to this epsilon bandwidth criterion, because all these skipped points, they lie in this epsilon buffer of that straight line segment. However, this one here, that would not be allowed. So because this red point here lies outside of this buffer. And what you can do then to solve this optimization problem is basically first compute a graph of all feasible shortcuts, so all potential edges for the output. And then you need just to apply a shortest path algorithm to find the shortest path from the first to the last vertex, and you obtain an optimal solution with that. So formulations like that, based on shortcut graphs and shortest path formulations, are quite common for these simplification problems. And we developed a similar method, not for, well, just some cartographic lines, but in particular for building footprints. There you would like to maintain right angles, which are important characteristics of human-made objects. So rather than selecting vertices, as in the method I showed before, we select edges. We would like to ensure somehow that this maximum error is below epsilon. And again, we try to minimize the number of vertices as a basic optimization method. So, and that could look like this in the output. Well, and a third type of graph that we frequently use, it's defined as, or it's stated as conflict graphs. These are quite often used for selection tasks or label placement problems. So, well, what you would like to do usually is that you have a large set of point features in a map. These you would like to annotate with text, with maybe rectangular text labels, but you cannot label every point because that would produce a lot of clutter and many overlapping labels, which would not be readable, not be legible anymore. So here we need this selection, which was also in the definition of a map by the International Cartographic Association. So selection problems like this, they often require these conflict graphs. And what we can do there is, well, basically make a selection of rectangles such that in the output, then we don't have any conflict left. So this is the input and this would be the output then. Well, again, here we need graph theoretical concepts. For example, this could be the input. What we do then is we compute a so-called conflict graph, which contains the vertex for every of our input rectangles and an edge modeling pairwise conflicts between these rectangles. And then what we do is that in this conflict graph, we compute what is known as an independent set, meaning we make a selection of vertices such that no two selected vertices are connected with an edge. That is called an independent set in computer science. And we would like to select as many rectangles as possible usually. That's why we try to maximize the size of this independent set. Well, and the solution we obtain for that then can be translated back into this geometric representation where we have a selection of rectangles afterwards. So these are three examples, or this one actually we worked on ourselves. This is a large instance we solved optimally. It's a world map with something like 58,000 rectangles. This can be solved to optimality, although it's an NP-complete problem. So NP-complete problems are problems of high computational complexity. And the best known algorithms for such problems, they have an exponential worst case running time. So that's why often these problems are really challenging. So if you think that something like, well, more than half an hour for solving such an instance, that this is slow, no, in fact, this is a really lucky case where we were able to solve such a large instance. Yeah, so these exact algorithms often are rather slow for our problems. Nevertheless, I think that optimization is a really promising and well-working approach for cartographic problems. And here I'm going to explain like the overall methodology of our research and what we actually try to answer, what kind of research questions we have and what we try to address with our research. So what we do usually is that we take these cartographic problems and first of all, we somehow need to formalize them. We need to model them in mathematical terms. So we need to specify hard constraints that a solution has to fulfill. We need to define optimization objectives, something that we would like to optimize. And then, well, in an ideal situation, we can take our real world instances, like the actual data, and develop exact algorithms to compute optimal solutions. That would be, of course, the wish that we have. And What we can do then is to evaluate these solutions, for example, with user studies or expert studies, or by comparisons with existing maps with reference solutions. So from that, we can then infer something about our model. We can say, is this model appropriate? Did we miss any important criteria? And this then can be fed into our model. So this model can be revised or refined. We have a better understanding of our cartographic problem and can again think of algorithms for solving this. This is usually, well, the ideal situation, but unfortunately, well, this story is actually too nice to be true, I have to say. Because, well, as I mentioned already, our problems are often of very high computational complexity, and having an exact algorithm that can solve our instances optimally is not realistic, especially not if you are in a big data context, or if you would like to have an interactive performance, real-time application, for example, as we have nowadays quite often. So the situation that we have in our research projects is more like that. We usually take two different approaches. First of all, well, this is what you have seen before. Basically, we deal with small instances only, so small samples that we draw from our real-world data. And for that, we can use exact methods. What we do quite often is that we use mathematical programming approaches, integer linear programming, for example, and with that we can compute solutions with proven optimality. And on the other hand, we have our real-world instances, large instances, which we can solve only with heuristic methods, maybe also with approximation algorithms that provide us with some guarantee of quality. But these solutions that we get, well, maybe they are satisfactory, but actually they are of unknown quality. We don't know, first of all, how good these solutions are with respect to optimality. So what we can do then is we have research questions like this. How adequate is the mathematical model? If we want to answer this research question, what we should do is we should analyze these optimal solutions here, because they are not influenced by any heuristic choices. So this evaluation can be done with users or experts, or by comparisons with reference solutions, as I said before. Then another important research question that we often try to answer is, how good is an inexact method, a heuristic, for example, in practice? And if we want to answer this research question, we usually do a comparison between solutions that we obtain with our exact methods and the solutions obtained by our heuristics that we want to evaluate. And another question that is of high importance is actually concerning with the efficiency of our methods. How fast are they, and how fast can it be actually? How fast can we solve these problems? So the method here, there's not just a single method, but actually a whole set of methods which are provided by the discipline called algorithm engineering. So we spend a lot of engineering to make our algorithms fast. We use, for example, sophisticated optimization methods like branch and cut methods for solving our mathematical problems. Well, and we develop data structures for speeding up our algorithms. Also, we do mathematical analysis of our methods, like we analyze the worst case running times of our algorithms and these things. What is interesting, however, that, well, finding fast methods has different motivations here. So if we think of these heuristic methods, well, the motivation is quite obvious. We would like to, we would like to deal with real-time scenarios We would like to handle big data, so that's why we need fast methods. For these methods here, why should they be fast if we just use them for evaluation? Well, here it's actually the case as a rule of thumb that the larger the instances that we can solve, the more realistic is the setting. And that's why we need to also engineer these methods to efficiency. Well, so much about the general research methodology. And finally, I'm going to address two projects we are dealing with in my group. The first one is called Zuma Maps. It's a DFG project. And it's dealing with cartography on small screens like smartphones or smartwatches even. And well, the situation here, maybe, well, if you think back to these old days when we were used to traveling, maybe that's a situation you can still remember, that you were maybe planning to find a hotel in Munich like this. Yeah, if you use online maps for that, you often find these extremely cluttered maps with a lot of overlaps between the labels. And what you need to do then is that you need to zoom in to an extremely large scale to resolve these conflicts. And that is bad, because with that you lose the context and the overview. So that is what we would like to avoid. So the idea here is how can we explore the map at a fixed and preferably small scale, so that we can avoid to zoom into this extremely large scale, but actually do the exploration on a smaller scale where we still have the overview. So one idea to answer this question is to distribute the information over multiple pages. So instead of requiring the user to zoom in to an extremely large scale, you always have this overview and you simply swipe from page to page. You always have the same background map, and with that you can navigate through even very large point size. And well, for this, it's a very similar graph theoretical approach as this label placement problem we've seen before. But instead of computing an independent set here, what we do with this conflict graph, we solve the problem called minimum vertex coloring. So basically, we color every point in this conflict graph such that no two adjacent points have the same color. And then we try to do this with as few colors as possible. And the idea is simply that every color defines one page. So here we would have 3 pages. This is not necessarily a planar graph, so this 4-color theorem does not apply, and often we need to use more than 4 colors and accordingly more than 4 pages. Well, I'd like to show this in a demo very shortly. So this is basically running in a web browser, and here you can see a solution that was computed using a heuristic algorithm which runs in real time in the web browser. Here you need to navigate through 4 pages, for example. But if you would display everything that would look like this, then there you would have a lot of clutter. So another project I would like to address, that is actually Phenorob. So there is computational cartography in Phenorob, and that's conducted by Annika Bonerath. You know her already from the tutorials that she has given on data management. And in fact, Annika works on computational cartography problems related to data management. This was inspired by big research data portals. For example, this is GBIF, that's the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. If you go to that data portal, you see this visualization here, which is interactive. So there you have actually the possibility to define a temporal range, to select data only within some temporal range. So all this data is basically event data, X, Y, T for time. And by defining this slider, you can interact with the map and always see the data available for the selected temporal range. So if you do this with the GBIF website, you will see that an update takes several seconds. And that is unsatisfactory if you think of, well, interactive exploration. So what we aim here is to do something very similar, but to achieve an interactive performance and also to study different ways of cartographic representations, aggregated visualizations, aggregated representations, for example, where these points are aggregated to polygons. Well, and that can also be seen in a demo, which I'm showing here. So let's go to the drawed data. Here, well, we see a map of Germany with drawds, and we can, with a slider here, we can select basically the drawds within the selected time frame. And in real time, we get this nice density map of drawds. So what you see is then here always the maximum value, the maximum soil moisture index within the selected temporal range. So that is something, here we have actually 18 million data points in a data structure to produce such visualizations. Well, and the idea here is inspired by methods from computational geometry. So there was this seminal paper by Bannister et al. Quite recently, actually. So this was published 2014 about a new type of data structure, namely called time windowed data structure. And well, they analyzed this, or they studied this idea for very fundamental problems of computational geometry, like convex hull computation, for example, or Euclidean minimum spanning trees. Yeah, so there's always the situation, you have a set of points with timestamps, and with this temporal range, you can filter out relevant points, and for the points within the filter, you would like to compute a convex hull or a Euclidean minimum spanning tree. And the same situation we have here, except that we are dealing with maps. And we are the first actually to combine this concept from computational geometry with cartography, namely with spatial density maps, as you see. Well, that brings me to the end of my presentation already. I think I've given you an idea of what computational cartography is dealing with. And to conclude this talk, I just want to point out that there is, of course, this intersection between computer science and cartography, but also there are a whole set of disciplines around this where it's not that easy actually to relate them to computer science or cartography. Many of them are somewhere in between, like information visualization, for example, that is, of course, related to both. Then we have algorithm engineering and computational geometry. There's also a lot of AI going on in computational cartography, which I was not addressing today. There are the theoretical computer scientists, many of them from the graph drawing community who are interested in this. HCI is, of course, also related to this. Then we have the disciplines, geodesy, remote sensing, photogrammetry, dealing with the data acquisition, geography also providing methodology. And then you also need to think of all the application disciplines like agriculture, for example, geology or soil sciences. All these disciplines are interested in maps and use them for their applications, of course. So what you can see here is that computational cartography is truly a transdisciplinary discipline, I would say. And with that, I'd like to conclude my talk, and thank you very much for your attention.